Hello YouTube and hello viewers, and welcome back to episode 4 of creating our social media application using Laravel. We've done a lot so far. I mean, we've got our environments up and running, we've got multiple instances running, we've now got our database up and running. So today's session is going to be all about setting up how do we get our information. So how are we going to set up this API to send and retrieve our data, or even update data and things like that. So we're going to be looking at a few things of how we manage to do that. So it's going to be a little bit of a lengthy video, so maybe you might have to pause every now and again just to see what I'm being up to. But by the end of it, we'll have some data coming back from an API that we're going to create in this session. So let's get started. So before we begin this session, there's another piece of software that I'm going to need you to download. So if you want to hop over onto your browser, and inside your browser, you want to type in Postman. Not Postman Pat, we don't want to get that. But basically, you want to get Postman, which is an application that's free to use that you can use to send and receive requests to URLs that you would create your APIs from. So in this case, remember that our URL is something like laravel.test. We're going to send off a request to that URL, and we're going to retrieve data, we're going to update data, we're going to do something with that. Now, as I say, it's free to use. You can quite easily download it. You just go to download here. Then you just download the application. There might be a donation thing. I'm not sure, like Heidi, but you can support them if needs be. But you can see that on the interface, it's quite straightforward. We've just got a place where we can put all our collections, the request types that we can do, for example, gets, posts, and etc. And then you can see that we're going to specific URLs, and then when we go to the URL, when we hit send, we're going to get some type of response back from that. And that's what we need from the API, because don't forget, we're not making this front-end application. We're creating an application that can handle data, so we can send it some information, and then we can retrieve that information, we can process it on the server, and then we can spit it back out. And then that way our front-end guys can then pick it up, whoever's doing the nice fancy stuff in the front, and they can have some information back from the server, which is dead easy to do. So get yourselves Postman, download it, and you'll land up with something like this. Now I've got it on dark mode. I always like things in dark mode. It's up to you how you want to have yours, but I prefer it like that. And basically all I've done is I've created myself my own little workspace here on, actually it's gone onto the team. I should move this. Actually we'll delete that because it's part of my team. If I go back to personal, we'll just use my workspace in this case, so it'll be the same. But I created a new one, and then I just called it YouTube. But we can leave it in here for now. It's fine. It's not a problem. So you can see by default, we get this little API. So if I press send on here, for example, you can see that you get a lot of data back off this API URL. And this is a GitHub thing. And basically, this gives all the information back from the GitHub users that currently exist. I think I pulled this from somewhere just to test. You can have a look at that, pause it if you want, and then stick it in and see what your response back. That's perfectly fine. But in this case, we're not going to be using that because we're going to be using our own URL, which is pretty cool. So once you got that, we can leave that for now. We can minimize them. We're going to move on to creating stuff for our way that we can send information to these. And to do this, we need to set up things called routes. So if we go into our Laravel project, let's close all this down because we don't need it. But if we have a look in our directory listing, we should see something called routes, which is just here. And with these routes, we have a few things like API, channel, console, and web. Obviously, what we're building is an API, so we're going to open up that. And you can see it kind of gives us an example route here. Now, this example one's pretty useful for us because this is going to be for anything that we're going to do with users. So what we're going to do is we're going to just comment this one out for now. So if you just, PHP Storm is quite nice because I can select it all, hold Control and press /, that will comment that whole section out. So that's nice and easy for me. But here you can see in this bit of section, all we're doing is it's calling something, our middleware, and then we go into a specific route, and then it sort of sends its request. Now this is a very old school way of doing it. I'm going to show you a nice clean way of doing this stuff, obviously during this tutorial. But how does this actually work? So basically we send in the request. So let's say, for example, we're going to go to www.laravel.test, for example. And then on your domains, you normally have a /, and let's say, for example, we call this test. So what will happen is if I send a request off to this, it needs to do something pretty much. And we set up this something, so this /test in this routes. And then we need to push it somewhere inside our Laravel project to start working with all its logic. So what I mean by logic is like all the data that we're going to be using, etc. For this episode, we're just going to do something very simplistic and just send back like a hello world, for example. But we are going to set up like a little test environment to play with, and then we're going to get into some really in-depth way of how we work with these routes in the next few videos. So normally what happens is we send the data off into this app structure, HTTP, and then we have these things called controllers. And the controllers pretty much manage, well, we don't have to send it to a controller, but it's nice and easy because if you have to think about it as like an airport, you have the people that are inside the tower and they're kind of directing the planes and stuff. Think of your controllers that way. So the route comes in, so the plane's on its way in. It comes to the controller, who's the air guy, and then the air guy's like, okay, I'm going to send you off to go do something. And then that's how we're going to handle the logic. So the controller takes all the information that the user or the airplane's coming in, and so the user's all sending to that conductor, and then he says, okay, I'm going to pass this information on to someone. So the first thing we're going to do in this episode is we're actually going to create a controller. Now this is going to be a play around controller. We're going to be making a lot more, but the first one we're going to do is just going to be a play around controller. So we're going to go onto our console. So you can see I'm still in my project called Laravel. Notice I'm not going to go in the container this time like the previous project, but I'm just going to do PHP artisan inside this project. And we can see when I do PHP artisan, I should, oh, it's because I've got this Laravel test. It doesn't like that. So actually let's comment that out. Yeah. And let's run that again. And we should get the whole listing of all the stuff that we saw in the previous video. But this time I'm not actually in the container. We only have to run migrations in the container. But we can make this little controller. So remember I told you the controller is something that's going to, well, the conductor that's going to send information around. So we're going to make a little practice controller so you can practice a few things. So remember to do this. We type PHP artisan, and if I can spell, and spelled artisan wrong already. So make controller. So remember we just put the rest of the name on, and we're actually going to give it a name. So a good way of, just some coding practices is that we make sure that we camel case these controllers. So we're going to call this test controller. Okay, so in this case, this is just going to be our test controller because we're going to play around with it in this episode. In the next one, we're actually going to make proper controllers that we can manage our data correctly. So we're going to make this controller, press enter. It's going to say, okay, well, I've made this controller for you. Now you'll notice that it's singular. I haven't called it test controllers, even though we might be getting lots of requests to that controller, but we can manage, just don't call it plural, it's just better. So we're going to go to our project, and if we go into our controllers now, you can see that we've got this new test controller. And this test controller actually extends off this original controller, which does a few things like validates requests, and we're going to have a look at all this cool stuff later on. Authorization requests, there's some cool stuff that these things do on the side, but really we're going to work inside this test controller. Now, we need to send some information to our test controller, so we're going to send some information on our API. And what we're going to do is we just want to get like a very simple hello world bit of information coming back. So we're going to use something called route, and this is by default. You'll always call this route, and you do our two little dots here, and we're going to do it as a get request. So we want to get some information back from the route. And again, I'll be explaining each one of these whilst we go through them. Open and close the brackets, and we're just going to put a semicolon at the end. So get, basically, you don't send any data at all. This is just a route that we can just send something. So remember on Postman, we did this. You can see that it's set as a get, and we had this URL. We hit send, and it just sends a request to this endpoint, and we get all this data. So that's all that get is referring to. So we need to do something very similar. Now remember I said that we have this www.laravel.test and we have /test. Now, what we want to do is inside this get, we need to make that /, so this URI. So it'll get this bit. It'll be like, okay, I know what this is. This www laravel.test /, and then we just need to give it a route. So let's just call this hello world. So in this case, when we send it, it's going to be www.laravel.test / hello world, like that. But this isn't really telling it, so which air traffic controller am I going to go to? So who am I going to speak to? So we need to tell it to speak to something. And we're going to speak to the new controller we made, so this test controller. So if we type in test controller, but then even though we're going to the controller, we need to give it an action. So we're going to the controller and we need to do something inside that controller. And we can just put a little @ on there and we can just call it hello world. Now you could call this whatever. I mean, we could call it Bob, we can call it whatever you want. But in this case, because we're sticking with naming conventions, it's just a little bit more easier. So what we're doing is we're going to say, okay, I'm going to go to this URL. And then when I hit this URL, I'm going to hit this controller, so our test controller, and I'm going to run a function inside my test controller called hello world. A little bit confusing, but it'll make sense in a second. So if we open up our test controller, and inside our class, we're going to make a new function, so public function, and it needs to be the exact name that we came off on this controller. So we're going to call it hello world. So we're going to call it hello world, open close brackets, and we're going to put our curlies. Now, basically, this is not going to do anything because it's empty. So we're not going to get any response back or anything because there's nothing in there. But if we had to say return, open close quotation, and we're just going to return back hello world. Close that. So this is just returning back a string. If you're not really familiar with simple PHP syntax, maybe have a look at one of my earlier videos. I go over a very basic PHP syntax. You're more than welcome to have a look at that and then jump back onto this video. But basically, this is just returning some text back saying hello world. So let's test this. So we know that in the route, so if we go back to the API, the route we're going to need is this get, and we're going to go to this URI called hello world. So it's going to be / hello world, and then it's going to go to this test controller. So let's actually try that in Postman. So let's go into Postman, and we're going to do HTTP because we haven't done SSL. So we're going to do HTTP laravel.test, which is our URL, and we do / hello world on the end of it. So if we press send, we get an error. We're like, but why is that the case? Because you said to us, if we have this HTTP laravel.test / hello world, that's what you said inside the URL string. But there is always a but to this. It's not as simple as this. Now, if you get confused and you make loads and loads and loads and loads of these, there's an easy way to see exactly what those routes look like, or what the URLs would be for every single one of those routes that you've created. So let's check that out. So let's go back into our console, and we're going to do a PHP artisan. Okay, but this time we're going to call something called route list and press enter. Now this is going to give us all the routes that we've got inside our Laravel project, and you can see we've got this / one, which is just a basic /, but you can see this is calling web, but then this one is calling API, and that's the important one. And we can see that it's going to this action, so our controller. But if you have a look at the URI, it's not just / hello world. It's actually API / hello world. And that's because we're building an API. And generically, all Laravel projects have this API in front of it, unless it's web. So in this case, web, we don't have that, because web, you have like index.php, aboutus.php, that type of stuff. You don't need API on the end of that. But because we're using data, we're just going to use this API / hello world. So let's go back to Postman. Let's check that out. So let's actually put API in front of this, put a / and hit send. And there we go. We get our response back from our piece of software that we're creating on our API, and it's actually called hello world. We could do the same thing again. So if we go back to the project and we send something different, so let's go to the test controller. Let's just make two variables. So we're just going to call this var1 equals Timmy. Put that in quotes. And then we'll just do the same again. This time we're going to call it var2 and we're just going to call it Timmy. I don't know, Saffron, some strange names coming up my head. And we're just going to return back some information. So in this case, we're just going to have var1 dot, and then we're going to put a space and then concatenate onto var2. So this will technically return back Timmy here, space, and then Saffron. So we can quite easily send that off. So let's have a look. Let's run it on our API. And there we go. We get Timmy Saffron back. Now, this is a very basic idea of what's happening with this GET request, but let's just save this. So we're going to save as, and we're just going to call the request name get hello world. And we'll just save it to a collection called YouTube. We've got YouTube and we've got a simple GET request here. So what about the other ones? So let's try this post. So let's have a look at this route. Sorry, I went to the wrong place. We'll go back to the project. Let's go into API and let's do a post one. So let's just duplicate that line. If you're using PHP Storm, it's Control-D to duplicate. And this time we're going to post. We just change the get to a post. Now post is when you're sending data. So you're going to be sending data from a user to the actual place that we go in. So we're going to call it, we can call it hello world if we want. It doesn't matter. We can have the same name, which is also cool because it's a different type of route. So we can use get with the same name. It doesn't really matter, just as long as we have a different action. Now, remember, this is a test route. In the future episodes, these are going to be named a lot more better. And there's some nice things that we can see in the future episodes about these routes that we don't have to call get and post. We can actually call something like resource, which is all of them. And we have like a nice little template setup. But for this example, you can see what's happening. So we're going to post the same location, but this time we're just going to go, it has to be a separate function. So we can just call this hello world post. So camel case here. I should really camel case that one. So we go into our controller and we're going to do the same thing again. Now, I also want to remind you that logic is not going to belong in controllers. As I say, I'm going to talk about methodology and different ways how we work with these controllers. But at the moment, just for test purposes, you can see it working with inside the controller. So remember, we called this inside the API hello world post. So I'm just going to copy that, paste, open and close. Now, the difference between a post and a get, inside here in our function, we don't need anything in here because we're just retrieving data. But if you think about what we're getting back or we're sending data, we're going to need something inside our post. And in this case, it's called a request. And the request is going to come from our facade here. So normally you'd use it up here. So I could actually get rid of that. Have that. And you'll have $request. So this is saying, if I put some information inside my Postman and I send to this route, there's going to be some data inside this request. And that's the data will be set inside Postman. And I'll show you that in a second. And then the easiest way to see anything is that we can DD, which is going to die. And we can just throw out some information. So if you do request and all, this is going to give everything with inside that request. So anything that we're pushing inside the form, what do we get back? So let's try it out. So let's go into Postman. I'm going to create a new one. And we're going to say post. Copy the URL because why not? I'm going to show you how to set up Postman quite nicely with these environment variables. But again, this is just an episode just to get you used to using requests. So we're going to post to this location. Remember, if we look at our route list, do it again, you can see we've got two now, exactly the same URI, which is fine as long as the function's slightly different. But this time you can see that we have this post and it's going to the same location. If I am sending to this location, I need to make sure it's post, and we're just going to put some form data. So if we pass in like first name, That's not first name. First name. Oh my god, my keyboard. Unfortunately, because I've been working at home, my keyboard's falling to pieces. First name, last name, and then age. Let's just send all that data. So we're sending 3 form fields. First name is Wayne Fellows, and I'm 90. I'm not really, but we'll just say 90 in this instance. So if I send this off now, you can see it's passing parameters into that hello world. And if I press send, you can see we get this weird jargon. That's because I've called the DD, so the dump. If we go on preview, you can see that we've got first name, last name, and my age all being passed in from the form. Nice and easy, right? But let's say, for example, I want that data. So I want to use it. At the moment, I'm just killing it. It's just dead. Well, it's dead simple. We can set up some variables. Now, remember, I'm going to repeat this again. We're not going to be using controllers to handle logic, but inside this tutorial, we're just going to use it for this episode. So $request, because that's where the DD is. So the request that's coming in. And inside the request, I'm passing in these parameters. You can see it's part of an array, and I'm getting these parameters. So if I want this first name, so I want Wayne, I can just grab that first name, and off my request, I can call first name. Okay, do the same for the other one. So I have $last name and $age, and we can have request last name. I think we called it last name, yeah. And age will be age. Okay, and then we can do very similar return like this. We need a return, otherwise nothing's going to show. But if we return first name, last name, and then we just add the extra age onto the end of this. So concatenate the age onto there, close that out, save, and let's test that in Postman. So we're hoping that inside the response, when I send this post off to this location, I should get that string. So if we hit send, and there we go. I get Wayne Fellows of 90. So this is really important because if you need, so say for example, your front end is sending a username and password, for example, like an email and their password, they'll send it in a form like this. We then retrieve it on our Laravel project. We then do the logic behind that, and then we spit it back out. So we just spit it out with the return. Now these are going to be different in the next few episodes, but this kind of shows you how we set it up, and it's dead easy. Remember, we just set up our API route, so we can use a get or a post. These will become more detailed, as I say, in the next few episodes. We give it a name, and then we pass it to our air controller, as we call it, from the airport. He then says, okay, this is the plane coming in, he's the post, and he needs to go to this runway, for example. So he needs to go to this function. And then once it's that function, it then will run it, and then we just return back some example code that we have. And then that comes back to our front-end user. So I hope you enjoyed this series, this episode. It was quite a nice one because we got to do a little bit of logic. Remember, this is very basic still. It's going to get a lot more in depth. In the next episode, we're going to start looking at proper requests. So as you noticed when I did that post request here into this test controller, the post request is just this request. We're actually going to make unique ones to check the information that we're passing in. So thank you for joining me on this one, and I hope to see you in the next one. If you liked it, don't forget to hit that like button. If you really, really like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Goodbye.